Hey everyone, Apprentice Alex here, and today I'm going to talk about a subject that I think is very relevant to this channel. I am going to be looking at and asking the question, why swords? What I mean by this is swords are so ingrained in modern pop culture as these weapons of warriors, the legendary swords, Excalibur, Grasscutter, the four swords under the heavens. Throughout all of this history, we have these legends of swords and swordsmen. So why is it specifically swords? There's plenty of videos around that you can go and watch that talk about how the spear is the superior battlefield weapon, and how the shield is far more effective in its job than, well, a sword was. So why do we have this romanticization of swords? The answer, as it turns out, has a lot to do with finances, weirdly enough. Swords were very expensive in period. During the height of when we think of as the, sword-wielding history, which was a very long stretch of history, by the way, ironically, the use of the sword was actually prolonged by the invention of the firearm. But that's a subject for a whole nother video. Now today I want to talk about the fact that in period, and when I say in period, I'm referring to in the relevant historical period to the conversation. In period, late Iron Age, Middle Ages, etc., hardenable steels were exuberantly expensive. And to make a good sword, you need hardenable steel. This is why they started pattern welding, to stretch the hardenable steel as long as possible. Now, if you look at something like a spear, or an axe, or even something a little more complicated, like a halberd, a sword is always going to need more hardenable steel to cover its cutting edge in order to get. That made them very expensive. That means that you had to be richer to own your own sword. Yes, there were armies that had swords as part of their, standard kit. Rome, for instance, but that's bronze. We'll get into bronze in another video. I'm specifically talking more about Iron Age swords right now, although there is some stuff from the Bronze Age that might become relevant to this video. See, when you had this, when it required a lot of money to be able to own your own sword, when it became a status symbol, this meant it was aspirational. On top of that, you had people who thought, well, there's all these rich people with swords, and they don't want to die, and dueling's very popular, so I am going to become a duelist and act on their behalf, and that's what became known as the professional second in dueling circles. This is where you start to see things like the period sword manuals. Guys like Lichtenhauer and Meyer took a weapons of the time and created manuals, schools of how to use them. Obviously, in other schools, there's different other cultures, there's different martial arts centered around the sword, kinjitsu, some varieties of kung fu, many Filipino martial arts, all center around the use of, swords or knives. Knives are a little different. We'll get into that a few minutes later. But the use of swords were used either by these duelists who were, lived a very risky life, but were heavily praised for what they did, or the very wealthy. An interesting modern analog might be owning a race car. Now, why is that a good modern analog? Well, like a period sword, something like a Ferrari Challenge Stradale, a challenge car, they're race cars, is very expensive. It's not something that anyone other than the highest of classes can obtain. As such, there is a connotation of wealth and status that comes with that. On top of that, the way for non-uber wealthy people, although admittedly with the way that things are going now, you still have to be quite wealthy to get behind the wheel of a car, historically, was to go and race for some rich guy that owned the car. Nowadays, you have to be pretty darn wealthy just to become a racing driver, which in and of itself, you had to have a certain amount of financial stability in order to become a professional second, because, these schools, these sword schools, were selling a product. So the professional seconds were like racing drivers. The owners of swords were like the rich guys owning Ferraris now. And of course, your predominant method of storytelling back then was word of mouth and occasionally theater. Later in period, at least. And earlier in period, I don't know. I don't know the history of theater that well, thinking about it. I know the history of swords. But anyway, entertainment, of course, always plays a role, storytelling especially, in the romanticization of everything. Because swords were fairly exclusive in period, you ended up with a really, with a romanticization in period of them. And that continues on, especially as swords fall out of use. What's left behind? The stories, the exaggerations, the romantic vision of the sword-wielding warrior. This despite the fact that swords weren't the most effective weapons. Basically ever. At any period you can look at, either other weapons or armor were surpassing swords in use. And when I say armor was surpassing swords in use, I don't necessarily mean that more people were using armor. I mean that swords weren't effective against the armor. Probably a bad turn of phrase there. I'm sorry about that. I'm still learning all the ropes of this whole content creation thing. Anyway, when you had a sword, that was a status symbol. Now, a lot of people did have long knives, which kind of to the modern eye might look kind of swordish. The thing about these is that they were designed differently, and there were some cheats. For example, saxes. I make a lot of saxes. I love saxes. They're great knives. The modern ones that we make, their handles are way too short compared to period. In period, their handles were about as long as the blade, so you could get more leverage on them. So you, again, this was to save steel. You could get a more versatile tool for less steel. Knives were more versatile than swords because swords were designed for one thing and one thing only, and that was combat. You have axes. Yes, a Dane axe is not a felling axe, but if you're going to invest in a weapon of war and you're not going to be warring all the time, you'd rather have something that you could bring back to the family farm after the war's done, and at least, you can hang it over your mantle and everything and have the memories, but then you can at least chop some wood if you really need to. Maybe the haft on your other axe is broken and you really need to chop some firewood. It can happen. Also, on that subject, the idea of a professional soldier is not new, but wasn't commonplace until relatively recently in history. Philip of Macedonia, Alexander the Great's father, was very notable because he had a professional army. I believe he was the first professional army in the Western world. Alexander the Great continued this on. He actually used it as a part of his it's theorized he used that as a factor in his speech before facing Darius of Persia in one of his most famous battles. The fact that there really weren't professional soldiers other than the officer classes, your knights, your samurai, all of this, these people born to a specific role, more or less, that the vast majority of your soldiers were conscripts. Of course, you're not going to, if you're a soldier, you're not going to pay for, if you're a foot soldier, you probably don't have the financial means to buy a sword. And if you're the guy outfitting this conscript, you don't want to waste the resources on cannon fodder. So swords, again, very exclusive. I'm sorry this video has been a little rambling. Because there's so many things that tie into each other with this stuff. And that brings us to the modern day. Again, we're left with stories. We're left with this idea that the sword was the weapon of warriors, the weapon of kings. And it was certainly the weapon of kings. Because again, expensive. I can't drill that in enough. As somebody that makes swords, that fights with swords, that absolutely loves swords, the idea that the use of the sword was like super commonplace and throughout history, not untrue, but not true in the same way that I think a lot of people think. All right, I'll use an example here. Conan the Barbarian, this kind of lone, barbarous warrior with his giant broadsword. If you were going to do that, you'd see somebody like Conan. If you were going to look at this from more of a historical perspective, someone like Conan, it's much more likely his primary weapon would have been something like some variety of axe. As a sidearm, he probably would have had a long knife. That would be more a kind of standard berserker kit, which, obviously Conan not a berserker, as it were, but very much in that vein, because the berserker is... There's an argument to be made that the berserkers are heavily influenced our idea of the quote-unquote barbarian warrior. I don't mean to say that you can't give your warrior a sword. I play tons of Dungeons & Dragons. I use swords constantly myself. But I think it is important to understand these historical contexts. That, if you look at, for example, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, if you look at the... Sorry, losing track of my notes and whatnot. If you look at the prices of the various weapons, swords are pretty averagely priced. If you were going to make those more of a realistic price guide, well, let's see. Let's say, I don't remember, I think spear is like 15 gold or something. Let's say a longsword is 3 times the... let's say a longsword is 3 times the amount of hardenable steel required from a spear. So yeah, you're looking at an additional work. So over 100 gold for a sword. That doesn't really work out for game balance. And again, Dungeons & Dragons is about fantasy. It's about living a fantasy. And swords are so ingrained as part of that fantasy. So I guess what I'm trying to say, and to wrap this all up, because I've been ranting for a little while now, to wrap this all up, swords have an interesting place in history because they are romanticized today, but they were also romanticized in period, but for different reasons than were romanticized today. But it's the reasons that they were romanticized in period that we are left with these stories that create the modern day romantic ideal of the sword. Thank you so much for watching. Till next time. Hi everybody, Apprentice Alex here, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you're interested in learning more about the details involved in the craft of bladesmithing, please check out our main channel at youtube.com/oldworldironworks. My teacher Bear already has a couple of great tutorial videos up there, which are a little older, but more is on the way. If you're interested in supporting the shop, then of course, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Share the videos around. You can find us on our web store at oldworldironworks.net, or you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/oldworldironworks. Again, means the world to us. Thank you so much. Links in the description below.